He traded 6 John Deeres for 1 Massey Ferguson. His neighbors called the bank. The fields outside Bloomington, Illinois don't forgive hesitation. They reward preparation, horsepower, and nerve. And in the spring of 2019, Dale Whitmore had all three, or at least he thought he did. Dale was 51 years old, third generation. His grandfather had broken this ground with a two-bottom plow and a mule that didn't want to work. His father had built it into something respectable, a corn and soybean operation that fed the family, paid the notes, and kept the lights on through 3 decades of volatile commodity prices. Dale had inherited 1,800 acres and grown it to just over 3,100 acres by the time this story really begins. He also inherited 6 John Deere tractors, not 6 identical machines, not a clean, coordinated fleet. 6 tractors acquired over 22 years of reactive buying, a 7810 from 2001, a pair of 8320s from 2008 that were drinking hydraulic fluid by the quart, a 2014 8370R with a transmission that had been repaired twice and was starting to make a sound nobody wanted to diagnose, and 2 older utility tractors that still carried debt. 6 tractors, 6 insurance policies, 6 sets of service records, 6 machines that needed to be in the right place at the right time, every time, across 30,100 acres of central Illinois ground that waited for no one. The annual maintenance bill for that fleet was $47,000 in 2018. Not repairs, maintenance before anything broke and things broke. The 8370R's transmission came apart completely in October of 2018, 11 days before the end of harvest. The repair bill was $23,400. Dale paid it because he had no choice. You don't leave corn standing in central Illinois in October. By February of 2019, Dale Whitmore had made a decision that nobody around him understood. He was going to sell all 6 John Deeres, and he was going to replace them with one machine. The machine he had in mind was a Massey Ferguson MF 9S.285, 285 horsepower CVT transmission, a tractor rebuilt from the ground up to compete at the top of the power tier where John Deere and Case IH had been comfortable for too long. Dale had seen one at a farm show in Champaign in November. He had sat in the cab for 40 minutes. He had looked at the hydraulic flow numbers, the fuel consumption data, and the projected cost per hour figures. He had gone home and spent 3 months doing his own math. The math said one thing clearly: consolidate around one primary tractor, supplement with 2 small utility units he already owned free and clear, and cut his annual equipment overhead by $28,000 to $34,000 per year. Eliminate 4 service contracts. Stop managing a 6-machine scheduling puzzle every time he needed to move iron across the farm. His neighbor Gary Fenner heard about the plan in early March. Gary farmed 2,200 acres to the north and east, ran a clean fleet of newer green machines, and had opinions he shared freely. Gary called on a Tuesday evening and spent 20 minutes explaining why the plan was foolish. One tractor was a single point of failure. One breakdown at the wrong moment, and you're done. With 6 machines, you have redundancy. You have options. Dale listened. He had made this argument himself at 2 a.m. The redundancy argument was real. But Dale had also spent 2018 watching his redundant fleet fail him in sequence. The 8370R in October, a hydraulic line on an 8320 that took 4 days to source because the part was back-ordered, a sensor failure on the 7810 that nobody could diagnose for 3 days. Redundancy was only valuable if the redundant machines actually worked. 6 aging tractors weren't redundancy. They were 6 different ways to lose a day. He called the Massey Ferguson dealer in Decatur on a Wednesday morning. The dealer, Frank Stoll, 30 years in the equipment business, listened carefully and asked the right questions. He did not try to talk Dale out of it. He did say the plan required a service agreement with real teeth, a guaranteed response window, and a loaner provision. Dale said he understood. The trade-in appraisals on the 6 John Deeres came back lower than Dale wanted and higher than he feared. Total package, $222,000 against a purchase price on the MF 9S285 of $287,000 with the extended service agreement. Net financed, $65,000. His ag lender at Farm Credit, Patrice Webb, approved it without enthusiasm. Word moved through the coffee shops and co-op parking lots of McLean County the way it always had. By the time the story reached Gary Fenner's version, Dale had borrowed $80,000 for a foreign machine. By the time it reached the elevator, it was $100,000, and the Massey had already broken down before it arrived. None of that was true. But the truth was complicated enough. The flatbed pulled into Dale's yard on a Thursday in late April. Frank Stoll's driver came personally, spent 2 hours going through the pre-delivery checklist, walked Dale through the Datatronic 5-monitor system and the hydraulic configuration. Dale had already watched every operator training video Massey Ferguson produced for this model. He was not a man who made a $287,000 decision and then failed to prepare for it. 6 tractors went out. 1 came in. Dale stood in that yard and watched the last green machine roll onto the trailer. There was a moment, brief, quiet, the kind that doesn't get talked about at the co-op or the elevator, where the full weight of the decision landed on him. 3 generations of John Deere iron, leaving his property in a single afternoon. His father's 7810, the pair of 8320s his father had never owned, but that had become part of the fabric of this operation. The 8370R that had cost him $23,400 11 months earlier and was now someone else's problem. 1 red machine sat where 6 had been. The yard looked different, emptier in a way that felt deliberate rather than abandoned. He stood there longer than he needed to, one hand on the fender of the Massey Ferguson, listening to the flatbed engine fade down the road. Then he went inside and looked at the numbers again. The numbers hadn't changed. The MF9S went to work the following Monday. The first 2 weeks were good, better than good. The CVT transmission was something Dale had to adjust to. He had run power shift transmissions his entire career, and the CVT felt at first like the machine was making decisions he wasn't making, but within 4 days he understood it. Within 8 days he trusted it. Fuel consumption was tracking close to spec, which meant significantly better than what the 8370R had been burning in comparable conditions. Gary Fenner drove past the field twice in the first week. Dale noticed. Then came the 9th of May. Dale was 4 hours into a tillage pass on his largest 340-acre field, working toward a planting window that the forecast said would close by the 14th, when the Datatronic 5 monitor threw a hydraulic pressure fault code. Not a warning, a fault. The machine dropped into reduced power mode automatically, and the hydraulic function to his toolbar fell to a fraction of working capacity. He stopped. He read the code. He called Frank Stoll's service department. The technician arrived at 3 o'clock, diagnosed by 4:15. Faulty pressure sensor, a 2-hour fix. The part was on the truck. The machine was running again at 5:40. Total downtime, 1 day. Total cost under the service agreement, 0. The story that circulated through McLean County was not about the fast repair or the 2-hour diagnosis. The story was that Dale Whitmore's Massey Ferguson had broken down 9 days after delivery. That version traveled fast. Patrice Webb heard it and called Dale. Dale told her what actually happened. She made a note in the file and said nothing further. But Dale understood the margins were not wide. 1 bad season and the narrative would write itself. He went back to work at 5:45 and ran until 10 that night. He finished the 340-acre field on the 11th. The planting window held until the 15th. He planted 2,900 acres that spring and finished 4 days ahead of his historical average. The MF9S ran 487 hours between May and the end of June without another fault code. Nobody circulated that part of the story. Summer was quiet in the right way. The corn went in tall and even. The weather cooperated. Enough rain in June, dry in July when dry was needed, a September that came in clear and held. But quieter than the fields was something Dale hadn't expected: the absence of fleet management noise. No coordinating 6 service intervals, no calls from Curtis about which tractor to use for which job, whether the 8320 with the hydraulic problem was okay on light work, whether the 7810 needed to go in before harvest. 1 machine. He knew where it was, what shape it was in, what it needed. Curtis, 43 years old, hired man for 19 years, not a man who gave compliments easily, told Dale in August that he hadn't felt this organized going into harvest in a decade. Dale wrote it down. Harvest started September 22nd. The MF9S ran grain cart, semi-loading, and primary transport for 31 days straight. It accumulated 614 hours in that window. Frank Stoll's technician came out twice for scheduled checks. Both times, nothing requiring repair. Corn yielded 221 bushels per acre, soybeans 61, both above Dale's 5-year average. The gross revenue figure was the strongest of his career. He sat down with the numbers in November. Equipment overhead for 2019, $31,200. The comparable figure for 2018 had been $71,400. The difference was $40,200 in 1 year, on a farm carrying $65,000 in new financing. He called Patrice Webb and walked her through it. She listened to the full presentation before she spoke. When she did, she said the operation looked stronger than it had 12 months ago. She scheduled a formal review for January. Dale said that was fine. He did not call Gary Fenner. Winter was for analysis. The Datatronic 5 had collected a full season of operational data, fuel consumption by field, by implement, by time of day. Dale found 3 fields where his tillage approach was burning more fuel per acre than average without producing better seedbed results. He adjusted. 6 tractors in 20 years of habit had never produced this kind of granular information. 6 tractors in 20 years of habit had never been connected to a system that recorded everything and asked nothing in return, except that you pay attention to what it told you. Dale paid attention. He also spent part of that winter thinking about what he had learned that had nothing to do with data. He had learned that a concentrated bet required a different kind of management than a distributed one. When you spread risk across 6 machines, you manage failure reactively. Something breaks, you fix it, you move to the next machine. When you concentrate everything into one, you manage failure proactively, because you cannot afford to be reactive. The service agreement, the relationship with Frank Stoll's shop, the pre-delivery preparation, those weren't extras. They were the architecture that made the consolidation viable. Strip any one of them out and the plan collapsed. He had also learned something about the social weight of an unconventional decision. The breakdown story had traveled faster and farther than any good news about the machine ever would. That was not unique to farming. That was how communities processed risk on behalf of their members, by amplifying the evidence that confirmed the conventional wisdom and minimizing the evidence that challenged it. Gary Fenner's phone call in March had not been malicious. It had been a community performing its function. Dale had listened, evaluated, and disagreed. That was his right and his responsibility. The farm was his. The decision was his. The consequences, good or bad, were his. He had been right, but he had also been fortunate in ways that mattered. The pressure sensor had failed in May rather than in October. Frank Stoll's technician had the part on the truck. The weather in 2019 had cooperated at the critical moments. None of those things were guaranteed by the decision itself. The decision had created conditions for success. The conditions had held. Dale understood the difference. He did not mistake good outcomes for proof that the risk had been smaller than it was. The spring of 2020 brought pressure that had nothing to do with tractors. Input costs came in elevated. The cash rent on 400 new acres, heavy, poorly drained ground from a retiring neighbor named Harold Beck, was priced at margins that required commodity prices to cooperate. Commodity prices in 2020 were not cooperative through the first half of the season. Harold Beck had farmed his ground for 40 years through 2 different tillage philosophies and had the soil samples to prove the history. He told Dale, the ground had always responded to aggressive primary tillage in the fall. It needed horsepower. It needed weight on the drawbar. He said he was glad to see it going to someone with equipment that could handle it. Harold Beck had driven John Deere for 4 decades. He said the Massey looked like a serious machine. That was the closest thing to a compliment Dale received from a John Deere man in McLean County in the first 2 years of running the MF9S. He took it. The MF9S handled Harold Beck's ground without complaint. The CVT kept the machine in its power band through wet corners, heavy clay knolls, the kind of variable ground that punished tractors working at the edge of their capacity. Dale ran the machine harder on that new ground than anywhere else on the farm. It responded the way machines respond when they have reserve capacity. The work isn't fully demanding. Curtis said in May that the tractor handled the new ground better than anything he had driven in 35 years of operating machinery. Dale filed that alongside what Curtis had said the previous August. 2 data points from a man who didn't offer them lightly. The summer was dry in July, 11 days above 95 degrees through pollination. Dale watched his fields with the helplessness farmers feel when weather is doing something no amount of horsepower or management can address. He ran his numbers repeatedly and adjusted his expectations downward in the measured, controlled way that experienced farmers adjust. Not in panic, but in recognition. The August rains came late, but adequately. Corn came in below his 5-year average, but above break-even on all but the thinnest margined fields. Soybeans came in at 58 bushels, a difficult year that worked. Equipment overhead for 2020, $33,800. Higher than 2019 by $2,600, primarily because one of the utility tractors needed a hydraulic pump. Still, $37,600 below the 2018 baseline. In a year where margins were under pressure across every operation in McLean County, that overhead reduction was not a line item. It was the difference between a year that worked and a year that didn't. He thought about his father that November. His father had built this operation through worse markets without GPS guidance or CVT transmissions or monitors that recorded fuel consumption by the acre. He had done it with discipline and stubbornness and an ability to read ground and weather that came from decades of paying attention. Dale had those things too. He had also made one decision his father might not have made, to trust math over familiarity, to trade 6 comfortable machines for one unfamiliar one, and to absorb the social friction of that choice without apology and without explanation. His father had been a practical man. Dale thought he would have understood the math, even if he would have taken longer to trust the machine. In the spring of 2021, Gary Fenner's operation had a difficult planting season. One of his primary tractors, a newer 8R series, developed an electrical fault that took 11 days to diagnose and repair. The dealer was backed up. The specific control module had to be sourced from a distribution center in Georgia. Gary lost 11 days in his May planting window. 11 days in central Illinois in May is not a scheduling inconvenience. It is a yield drag that shows up in October and doesn't show up anywhere else. You can't recover 11 planting days in June. You can't negotiate with the crop about when it went in the ground. The yield numbers in October are the yield numbers, and they carry the memory of every delay, every breakdown, every hour the machine sat when the window was open. Dale knew about it because Curtis heard it at the co-op. Dale did not comment. He had been close enough to that position in 2018. He knew what 11 lost days cost, financially and psychologically. He also understood that Gary's redundant fleet had not protected him. When one of 6 machines goes down and the parts aren't available and the dealer is backed up, you still lose your 11 days. The argument Gary had made in March of 2019, one breakdown and you're done, had not saved Gary from the same outcome distributed across a larger fleet. The risk had not been eliminated. It had been spread thinner and therefore made harder to see. The difference was preparation. The difference was a service agreement with a response guarantee and parts on the truck. That was the real insurance Dale had bought in 2019, and it had cost him less than 1 year of the maintenance differential between the old fleet and the new one. By the fall of 2021, Dale Whitmore was farming 3,500 acres. The MF9S had accumulated over 2,400 hours. 2 major scheduled service events, injectors, full driveline inspection, both came back clean. The machine was performing at the top of its projected service life curve. Annual equipment overhead, $29,400. 3rd consecutive year below $35,000. 3-year average before the consolidation, $62,000. He called Frank Stoll in October and said he wanted to talk about a second MF9S. Not because the first had failed, because it hadn't. Because the operation had grown to where a second primary unit was the next logical step, not redundancy, expansion. Cash rent opportunities were available that would push total acres toward 4,200. At that scale, one primary tractor was genuinely at the edge of capacity during planting and harvest windows. He needed a second machine, not to hedge against failure, but to handle the throughput that the operation had grown to require. Frank Stoll drove out on a Tuesday. They sat at the kitchen table with 3 seasons of Datatronic production data spread across the surface and worked through the numbers on a second unit. The conversation lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, Frank said he had been selling Massey Ferguson equipment for 11 years and had not seen a first-time buyer produce 3 seasons of operational data this clean. Dale said he thought the machine was well built. Frank said he thought the operator had something to do with it. They agreed on a second MF9S285 with delivery in March of 2022. Dale financed $71,000, a smaller gap than the first purchase, because his trade-in position was stronger and his farm credit profile had improved measurably across 3 years of clean financials. Patrice Webb, who had approved the first loan without enthusiasm and called in May of 2019 to ask about the breakdown story, approved the second financing in 48 hours without a single qualifying question. That, Dale thought, was its own kind of answer. Gary Fenner heard about the second Massey Ferguson in November. Dale knew because Curtis mentioned it, and because Gary's truck slowed in front of Dale's shed one afternoon when the new machine was parked outside next to the original, 2 red machines where 6 green ones used to be. Gary did not stop. He kept driving. Dale watched him go from the shop window. There was no animosity in it. Gary was a competent farmer who made considered decisions according to his own logic and his own risk tolerance. The ground between them was big enough for both philosophies. The market settled accounts without favoritism. But the accounting was clear. Dale Whitmore had traded 6 John Deeres for 1 Massey Ferguson in the spring of 2019. His neighbors had called the bank. The bank had called him. The machine had thrown a fault code 9 days after delivery, and the story had traveled across McLean County before the repair was even finished. And now he stood in a shed that used to hold 6 aging tractors and held 2 machines that were clean, current, and performing above projection, running 3,500 acres at equipment overhead that was less than half what it had been 4 years earlier, with papers signed for a 4th season and a 5th 1,000 acres on the horizon. The math had been right. The machine had been right. The decision had been right. He had known that in February of 2019, lying awake at 2 in the morning with a legal pad, running numbers that nobody around him was willing to run. The fields outside Bloomington, Illinois don't forgive hesitation. They reward preparation, horsepower, and nerve. Dale Whitmore had all 3. He always had.